All right, I'll kick things off, and then hopefully during the intro, I won't go too fast. Sharri will join us. So, and we have Liz obviously with us now. Thank you, Liz Storer, for joining us tonight.
Great to be here.
And to Sharri. Just to update our audience while we're waiting for Sharri to join us, our emergency fund was set up 4 weeks ago today, following the most horrific attacks on Jewish people since the Shoah. So far, the fund has supported Sderot and all the Gaza border regional councils, including their many traumatized kibbutzim and moshavim, as well as other southern communities further away from the border that have taken in thousands of evacuees. These funds have been used to provide medical and other supplies, social and mental health support and equipment for civil defense units and first responders. And we saw how critical those civil defense units were for some of the kibbutzim that managed to fend off the terrorists. Sadly, many could not. The response from our Australian community continues to be strong. If you'd like to support the emergency fund, a link has been placed in the chat box. The shock we've all felt since October 7 has been compounded by the appalling reaction of many around the world and the awful coverage by much of the world's media. So tonight, we're going to look at that. The coverage has not only distorted events, but contributed to them, such as we saw with the false reporting of the hospital bombing, fueled protests across the Middle East and beyond. So tonight, Sharri Markson and Liz Storer will explore this coverage, as well as the dreadful moral equivalence that has been applied to a lot of the reporting. They are both highly acclaimed journalists, each hosting a nightly program on Sky News. Sharri, which airs at 5 p.m. and has just aired, and the late debate at 10 p.m. And Sharri has just finished a show, and Liz will go on later. So as a result, they're both joining us from Sky Studios. And in a moment, we will see Sharri jump right up beside Liz, and we're grateful to you both for doing this tonight. After the initial discussion between Sharri and Liz, and they'll include some clips in that as well, we'll be happy to address questions from the audience. So please put them in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And perfect timing, Sharri has just arrived. So welcome, Sharri.
Hi, thank you. How are you?
Good. How are you? And thanks for racing over from your show to be with our audience. So I've just done the intro, so it's over to you and Liz. And I've said to the audience that we'll take questions after you and Liz have given your initial discussion and presentation. So thank you both.
Thank you. Do you want to start this, or do you want me to jump in? I'm more than happy to. Okay. Well, I think that for a starting point for this conversation is that to note that when the terror attacks on October 7 first happened, the media was very sympathetic to Israel. Yeah, I mean, 240 hostages, 1,400 Israelis killed. We saw the most horrific atrocities that anyone could have ever imagined. And, I think the descriptions and the comparisons to ISIS are so apt. Because what we've seen here is a terror organization targeting children, babies, the elderly, and having no mercy. But what I think is so shocking is that the sympathy for the Jewish community, the sympathy for the families in Israel was so short-lived. And both the media, the traditional media outlets, and influencers on social media inflamed the anti-Israel sentiment, which has very quickly turned into anti-Semitism. And this kind of irresponsible reporting, it's not just a case of negative coverage of Israel, but it has real life consequences, which is that the Jewish community here in Australia and around the world is now feeling deeply unsafe and even terrified. And Liz, I think the most recent example that makes everyone feel so shocked is what I was just speaking about on my show, the story in the Australian newspaper today about the Islamic preacher who, in the wake of the terror attacks, has called for jihad and basically issued an uprising to Muslims who feel anger to commit terror attacks in Australia.
And thankfully, this is someone who's come to the attention, made a headline today due to the fact that ASIO and others are looking into his activities. But there's footage which Sharri showed on her show, and I'll be showing this evening on my show, of him literally calling for jihad from, he's obviously an imam of some kind, a radical, and is not afraid to do so whatsoever. He literally says in this sermon, if they want to deport me, they can deport me. This is what we must do. One can only imagine how large his congregation is and how many people are actually listening and taking such a preacher seriously. But thankfully, of course, all the media coverage of this to date has been very much in favour of the fact that the authorities, the New South Wales Police, are looking into this man, and we can only hope that justice will be done in order to ensure that our community remains safe.
But it does show the type of communities, the type of people that are out there who can be influenced by irresponsible media reporting, like when the ABC and the New York Times and everyone came out and claimed that Israel had bombed a hospital, killing 500 people. You know, as experts have pointed out, Hamas announced the 500-person death toll within 5 or 10 minutes before anyone would have even had a chance to look at the bodies. Of course, it turned out no hospital was bombed. It was a hospital car park. Israel wasn't responsible. Palestinian Islamic Jihad was. And the death toll is closer, according to Israel, closer to 50, not 500. So it's that sort of irresponsible reporting that can easily inflame these dangerous elements in our society. And that's why I think it's so scary. Maybe if we start now looking at some of these examples of what we have seen that's been particularly egregious. JNF asked for our focus today to be on anti-Israel bias in the media. I mean, there's so much to talk about here, but this is the focus of this chat today. So let's start with Thomas Joyner. He was one of the ABC's Middle East correspondents, and he was exposed, Liz, in a WhatsApp group for calling into question whether or not Israel really had whether Hamas really had beheaded babies.
Yeah, and the very fact that thankfully someone obviously leaked this and it became known that he had sent this in a WhatsApp group, but the very fact that Joyner felt comfortable sharing such a disgusting sentiment amongst his journalistic colleagues in what we understand was a WhatsApp thread of other international reporters covering similar, just makes one wonder. We know that journalism can be dominated by the left. It depends on which media outlet you're talking about. But just what was going on in that thread, that he felt comfortable to say that such appalling claims were, in his words, quote, complete BS. End quote. So the ABC wasn't as swift either to condemn it as I thought they could be. However, they did pull him out of Israel. So at least they had the decency to recognise that he was no longer suited to be covering that particular post. And the ABC were grilled about it then by
Senate estimates.
Exactly.
I mean, but that is an issue that was front page of the Australian newspaper, where politicians took it up in the Senate and the ABC dealt with it. But there have been other quite egregious examples that haven't been dealt with. Danielle, if we can play the ABC clip, or Justine, if we can play the ABC clip.
What do we know of conditions now for civilians in Gaza?
Look, David, absolutely desperate. It is a very miserable place, very little food or water. Hospitals are run out of bandages, anaesthetics, painkillers, and now, according to Save the Children and UNICEF, almost 1,000 children a week are being killed in this war. And so that in itself is making a lot, certainly in the Arab and Muslim world surrounding Israel, a lot of them is asking the question now, is the killing of 1,000 children a week self-defence.
What do we know of conditions now for...
Okay. I mean, I think clearly John Lyons, who has a history of making, how should I put it, in a legally safe way, and a history of coverage that critics have said is anti-Israel, including a famous report he did on Four Corners several years ago. But he should have disclosed that those figures he was quoting when he accused Israel of killing 1,000 children a week were from Hamas, were from a terror organization. Like, it's extraordinary that Hamas has literally burnt, slaughtered babies, cut babies out of a pregnant woman's stomach, but then you have reporters who think, oh, they wouldn't possibly lie. We can take the figures they're giving us about how many people have died seriously, particularly when that hospital incident had already exposed the farce of those figures. But John Lyons, Liz, never disclosed that he was quoting figures from Hamas.
Yeah, and of course those figures are completely unsubstantiated. But we saw the New York Times, when they retracted their report about the hospitals being bombed, 500 civilians are dead, etc., and so on, they actually admitted that they too had taken their information from Hamas. So it's, unfortunately, it's not unique to Lyons here, but the fact that any media outlet worth a grain of salt could be taking their facts and figures, what they're actually reporting, from those that we know are on the terrorist side is just completely unbelievable. And yet reporting it as figures and facts. We all know that, as the saying goes, the first casualty in war is truth. And unfortunately, that has been aided and abetted by many in the left-wing media for as long as this war has been happening to date.
But again, it goes back to the consequences of that. People who see that prominent ABC report, who see that, oh, Israel's killing 1,000 children a week. They're not watching Sky News, people who are watching the ABC in all likelihood. And that's why you're getting this strong anti-Israel sentiment that in some sections of the community can translate into quite threatening behavior. Let's play, if we can, another grab from the ABC, if possible, the Press Club and Nicole Johnston.
Some people would come out and say that the issue of dozens of Israeli children being decapitated still hasn't been verified. I believe we still haven't seen sort of solid evidence of the widespread decapitation. So we've had the United Nations Secretary General come out with this very strong language, calling it the collective punishment of Gaza. That sort of language Israel will not be happy about. I think that was an important point by the United Nations today. It is true, though, that Hamas, Islamic Jihad and these other groups do fire rockets from all over Gaza. With 2.5 million people packed inside there, you can't fire a rocket from anywhere in Gaza that's not near civilian infrastructure.
So that's the ABC's former Middle East correspondent, Nicole Johnston. She apparently worked for about 12 years for the ABC. She was brought back onto the ABC in the wake of the Israel ambassador to Australia, Amir Maimon's address at the Press Club. So she was the first guest that the ABC had on after his address. And as you just heard there, Liz, she said, I mean, she's in a way basically defending Hamas's use of human shields. She's saying the population of Gaza is so densely populated that, where else are they going to fire rockets from? She doesn't say, well, they shouldn't fire rockets against Israel. She also again repeats that claim that there's no evidence for Israel beheading babies. Look, a lot of journalists are being invited to watch the raw, gruesome, unfiltered footage of October 7 just because of statements like that, because it is beyond belief the Hamas cruelty. And then you have heartless people like her saying, oh, there's no verification that babies were beheaded. Well, babies were burned. We've seen the evidence they were killed. Some were beheaded. I've personally seen Israeli soldiers lying there beheaded. Like, you know, I don't want to talk about this too much because I will cry again. It is so deeply upsetting.
Sure.
But this is so irresponsible from the ABC. And finally, Liz, I'll invite you to speak about her defense of the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, his comments that there was basically a context or a justification for the terror attacks.
The Secretary General literally told the Security Council that these attacks didn't happen in a vacuum. His exact words, basically insinuating the lines that we keep hearing from all the pro-Palestinian marches and those advocates that, oh, this is in the results of years and years of oppression, and that extremely ignorant narrative that has been fed by so many through our universities. I know that when I was at university, that was the pro-Palestinian narrative that was being taught to everybody in my class as well. And being a bit of a buff in ancient history, I was able to give my lecturer a bit of a tussle on that. But this is what we keep seeing come out of these, like you said, she's from the ABC, so not many surprises there. But what they also don't mention is to remind people, even if they want to couch their perspectives, they never remind people that Hamas started this. Hamas have built no protections for their people whatsoever, will not let them within the 5,000 kilometers of tunnels underneath Gaza, which Hamas keeps itself very safe. Hamas have spent millions in foreign aid on all their weaponry, which they're using on Israel, not on the people of Gaza. They have absolutely pummeled their own people into the ground. They're stealing their own resources, money that should be for Palestinian food, water, etc., and so on. And we've heard from international law experts to say no rules have been broken. Indeed, even if, and it wasn't true, but even if the initial story that the New York Times put out about a hospital having been bombed, according to Article 19 of the Geneva Convention, if terrorists or any military organization is using a hospital for their own military purposes, it is a legitimate target for whoever's taking them on. So again, that even when they report inaccurately these kinds of things, there's nothing in the article to say, by the way, as tragic as this may be, no laws have been broken because Hamas, as they often do, is hiding under their own people, and there's no other way to get through to them. I often say that nobody else is coming for the Palestinians but Israel. In terms of no one's coming to help them, no one's coming to deliver them from Hamas.
Well, Egypt certainly isn't.
No, none of the 52 Muslim majority countries, none of the surrounding 19 Arab states, none of them have taken a single Gazan. Egypt allowed a few through, but that was just to foreigners to get them back to their own countries, and that was just a couple of days ago. So
well, let's talk now about that also, you know, before we leave the ABC. And the ABC is important because, as they tell us all the time, they are Australia's most trusted media outlet.
national broadcaster.
They quote figures saying 80% of Australians trust them. You had the ABC National Radio host Patricia Karvelis asking Tony Burke if he would call Israel's actions genocide. It does seem, Liz, to be this complete obsession with Israel. We don't see in other wars or conflicts that we've seen around the world, you know, you don't see the Greens walking out because, you know, 10,000 people, civilians in Yemen were killed, or because of the death toll in Iran, or because what the Taliban is doing since they've seized control in Afghanistan, you know, refusing women access to medical care, education, forcing them to basically stay at home and be covered head to toe in the hijab. Women's rights have disappeared. You don't hear the Greens or Labor speaking about any of these issues, hardly ever. And instead, there is this complete obsession with Israel. And you can't help but think at the bottom of your heart that it is because Israel is the only Jewish state.
Yes.
And you know, you just wonder how much comes back to a you know, deeply ingrained anti-Semitism.
I think it absolutely all does. I mean, Hamas has been very clear In fact, we heard from a Hamas leader just last week. We played the clip. We weren't interviewing him, but he said, October 7th will happen again and again and again. We fully intend. And this is what is just mind-boggling, Sharri. They are so clear about their intentions, and that is the complete annihilation of Israel off the map. When they say from the river to the sea, they absolutely mean it. And it's only the Western media, the lefty-leaning Western media, that would say, oh, no, they're just oppressed. They're like, no, we're telling you what we intend to do. We're being very clear about our intentions here, and yet the West will still skew it in such a way as to tug on heartstrings and make people feel like, oh, it's the Palestinians that have been downtrodden, Israel's the oppressor, and therefore this war must be fought, not for the reasons we know it must be fought, but for the exact opposite.
And I was just going to add in there that, you know, you have the opposite in Israel taking every move to try and save civilian lives, and has been begging for about 3 weeks now for innocent or Palestinian civilians to move south
to the safe zone,
to the safe zone, setting up a safe zone. To, you know, and as you say, Hamas has poured hundreds of millions of dollars given to them by aid organizations, given to them by foreign governments like Australia and the United States, and they've poured that hundreds of millions of dollars into setting up a parallel Gaza Strip underneath in tunnels, rather than providing services and bomb shelters, as that Egyptian journalist passed out, but even just services for the Palestinian people to make their lives better. You think that Israel actually cares more about Palestinian lives than Hamas does, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that at all. Liz, do you want to bring in now the clip that you wanted to speak about from the ITV interview?
Yes. So what you're about to see is a lady who was featured on ITV. It's not BBC or any other ones that you may be aware of, but it's a big channel in the UK. This woman featured in a feature piece that they did about Islamophobia. And in that feature piece, she was very wide-eyed, saying how hard it is for Muslims in London now and how Islamophobia is on the rise. And then someone very easily unearthed this film of her that she'd made herself. She's filming herself in this. And this is the day of the October 7 massacres. Here she is. I don't think so.
Maybe you can, if there was no volume there, we couldn't hear volume. Maybe you can just tell them tell us what she said.
Sure. So she was openly gloating about what had just happened, saying nothing will take this feeling of euphoria and victory from us. The Israeli Zionist elites have now been brought low. They're embarrassed. This is basically just saying this was the most wonderful day ever. Now, one would assume that ITV, it would be incumbent upon them to do their research of anyone that they're giving a platform to at this time. Certainly, this was very easily uncovered by someone who simply jumped on Google to find out who this woman was. Turns out she works for Iran, and yet they platformed her. So you've got to wonder, did you not do your homework, or did you and you platformed her anyway? It's just another example of either just complete
incompetence,
or worse, having done it knowingly.
Yeah. But I mean, you can't give someone a platform to complain about Islamophobia when they're guilty of celebrating terrorist attacks against Jews.
Exactly.
Let's play this clip now, hopefully with the volume, a Channel 9 interview.
Why did you think it was important in Sydney last night?
It's important to be on the streets of Sydney last night and probably any other day, because we look for every opportunity to vocalize our stance against the Israeli occupation. It doesn't mean if the land of Palestine is 7,591 miles away from Gadigal land, then we are not in tune with the injustice and the reality. It's important because we want to say, even though we as Palestinians or even non-Palestinians, anyone who is human, will remember to take any opportunity to vocalize their stance against the Israeli occupation, to say no to injustice, to say no to ethnic cleansing, to say no to genocide, to say no to colonization.
We come out of that there. So that was one of the organizers of the Opera House protest. So, and if you can see, that clip was posted on October 10th. So October 10th, 3 days after the terror attacks, the Opera House protest was on the Monday night. And one of the organizers of that anti-Semitic rally at the Opera House was given the most easy platform imaginable by Channel 9, where, I don't know if you heard that question at the start there, the interviewer, and look, I don't blame her personally. She obviously isn't informed on this subject, but then she shouldn't have been conducting the interview. She said, why was your rally last night important? Why was your protest last night important? No mention of the anti-Semitism that we saw at that Opera House protest that went around the world, that gave Australia such a bad name when people chanted "Gas the Jews, death to the Jews," where the Israeli flag was burned. That was one of the worst interviews I've seen. Again, I don't think that reporter herself would be anti-Israel. I hope not. I just think she's an ill-informed television reporter. She shouldn't have been doing that interview, Liz. You know, if you are going to give a platform to people who have organized the most disgraceful anti-Semitic protest that the Premier, Chris Minns, has repeatedly apologized for. And, you know, and I should take the opportunity to say he has shown leadership on anti-Semitism, unlike Anthony Albanese, who we'll come to in a minute. But if you are going to give a platform to people like this and others who are in a similar position to her, then you've got to do a tough interview.
Absolutely. There were so many good questions to ask, like, do you believe that behavior is appropriate? Instead, it was all like, how are you feeling? How is the Palestinian contingent feeling? You can find the full interview online by Channel 9, but it is just another perfect exercise in what not to do if you're trying to, not even if you don't want to come across as pro either side, but if you simply want to be seen as bipartisan and doing any kind of journalistic job of it. Yeah. Absolutely appalling. And again, what matters is the message it sends to people at home. Just when we see absolutely no strong pushback in most media, and we certainly haven't seen it in terms of law enforcement and anyone actually being taken to task for attending these rallies and saying things that should never come out of anybody's mouth here in Australia.
And while freedom of speech is a fundamental principle of democracy, hate speech isn't, and inciting violence is actually unlawful and a crime, and the police have multiple avenues to take action, which the Shadow Attorney General, Mark Speakman, has outlined. I think I want to talk about now how some of the anti-Israel bias we're seeing in the media comes because the media take their cue often from politicians, from our Prime Minister, from our Foreign Minister, from the leading political figures. And while our 6 former prime ministers, so, this isn't a political thing. I think we're not coming at this from a political perspective saying one side of politics is better than the other, although we have seen one side of politics be better than the other. but this point I'm trying to make is that Bill Shorten has been a solid, strong friend of Israel. Dan Andrews has always been a strong friend of Israel. Julia Gillard has, even Kevin Rudd, Malcolm Turnbull, Tony Abbott, Scott Morrison. Our 6 most recent former prime ministers I believe, would all have gone to Israel to show solidarity, like Scott Morrison did overnight. The joint statement that they put out shows their commitment to both Israel and the Australian Jewish community. But what we've got in Albanese and Penny Wong is that they're both from the left faction of the Labor Party. And I think this issue has exposed that that's where their heart lies. I'm going to play you now a 2-minute clip, I think it's 2 minutes, of comments that Albanese has made throughout his career from when he was young, and the dates are on them, up until 2018, so very recently, before he became opposition leader and then Prime Minister, where his anti-Israel bias is abundantly clear. Have a look. If we have that clip.
No doubt there has been provocation in Gaza, but international law requires a proportionate response. And those people who have guns on one side and on the other side has rocks.
While many Israelis continue to demonise all Palestinians as terrorists, Palestinians experience Israelis as occupiers and employers of cheap labour, interrogators and jailers. Meanwhile, the government of Israel continues to allow fundamentalists to build illegal settlements on Palestinian land. In the grievance debate on Monday, I pointed out that it is now more than 35 years since UN Security Council Resolution 242 was carried, the 22nd of November 1967, calling for Israel to remove its military and its control of the occupied territories. Since that time, the systematic repression of the occupied by the occupiers has been at the core of Middle East politics. The Palestinians must be given their homeland. The occupation of Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem by the Israelis has created generations of oppressed people. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and subsequent events have produced up to 3.8 million Palestinian refugees to date. It is unfortunate that it was Israel who first funded Hamas.
Looked at a humiliation which Palestinians were forced to undertake in queuing to try to get across to get work each and every day, the ongoing extreme poverty that people were subjected to and the lack of rights.
So I think why I wanted to play this clip tonight, why I've played it a couple of times on my Sky News program, is because I think it's important to understand where Albanese comes from. And as I said, the most recent clip there was 2018, where he comes from when he now approaches Israel's war on Hamas as it is. He approaches it from that left-wing position of over his entire parliamentary career. And there's even another clip that I show where he's at a pro-Palestinian protest yelling into the microphone. And I think it's important because, you know, just on Thursday, he was asked a question by Claire Harvey at The Australian specifically about anti-Semitism. And he started answering. There was nothing wrong with his answer on anti-Semitism. It was a bit clinical. But then he moved his answer to talk about Islamophobia. We saw Kamala Harris last week announce a policy to tackle Islamophobia. We saw the White House press secretary, again, turn a question about anti-Semitism into an answer about Islamophobia. I'm not saying Islamophobia is not a problem and not important. We care for all lives, obviously. But clearly what we're seeing now unfold, it is undeniable, is an unprecedented and highly concerning explosion, a crisis in anti-Semitism, both in Australia and globally. And it's why both the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, and the ASIO boss, Mike Burgess, has said that there is a heightened, terror threat in the wake of the October 7 attacks. So, Liz, what do you think? Why do you think Albanese's long-held approach, and like I say, this isn't a Labor or Liberal issue. I praise the former Labor leaders who have been strong supporters of Israel, Bill Shorten, Dan Andrews, Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd. But why do you think this matters that he's traditionally approached Israel from this perspective?
Because it comes from the top down. And so even when this first started, obviously on October 7th, and he came out with what you really must at such opportunities, but he was very late in doing so. He was very late in responding. And even then it was quite half-hearted, I found. And so took it upon myself to remind absolutely everyone every time I talked about it that just 2 months prior to the day of October 7 was when he used Israel as a bargaining chip at the Labour's national conference where they decide their policy platform. And at that policy conference, they'd decided that it was now Australia's position that the West Bank and Gaza were occupied Palestinian territories, that any Israeli settlements were illegal. And of course, there's massive implications for that, not the least of which is stabbing a long-held and cherished ally in the back. But we have known...
And that follows the embassy move.
Exactly.
Or no longer recognising Jerusalem as the capital,
exactly.
Tel Aviv.
Yeah, 100%. And we have known for quite some time where his heart really lay. I believe we've still seen it shine through post October 7, and certainly the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, takes nearly every other day. She's still tweeting, telling Israel to pull their heads in and do better, etc. and so on, rather than condemning Hamas and telling Hamas, release these people and it's all over. Like, that's something else nobody ever talks about. This would all be over. Israel has said, you give us back our people, we'll down tools.
Well, she has condemned Hamas, but the focus every day is calling on Israel for, discussion about, is the response proportionate? And, and taking those figures about civilian casualties, when I saw that Ehud Olmert on 7:30 last week, he questioned whether any innocent civilians were killed at all in the strike on the Jabalayan refugee camp. He said on the ABC that as far as he's aware, there were no innocent civilians killed. I don't think Israel knows for sure, but you contrast that with the Prime Minister the next day on Thursday saying that he had enormous concern about that strike, and he said that publicly. I will just point out before we go to viewer questions that, there has been an amazing front page of the New York Post supporting the release of the hostages. The Sun in London did the same. Both of those newspapers are owned by News Corp. We work for Sky News, also owned by News Corp. I'd have to say overwhelmingly, our coverage has obviously been very supportive of Israel. And, I think I feel as a, passionate defender of Israel, as a member of the Jewish community, so grateful that I work for a company that cares so deeply about the issue of anti-Semitism. And, that's meant so much to me personally during the past few weeks, which have been difficult and distressing for every single member of the Jewish community. And of course, 1,000 times more traumatic for families in Israel whose loved ones were killed or are still being held hostage. Yeah. Dan, do you want us to open to questions now?
Great. Yes, thanks, Sharri and Liz. And maybe I'll just, firstly, I'll say that we've had a number of contributions from our audience, a lot of comments reinforcing various elements of your discussion, as well as thanking you for the reporting that you've been doing. So I'll echo that thank you. Maybe if I just combine some of the themes and pick up on what you've just been saying. In terms of what can be done to address this problem, a lot of us understand the why. Is it anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism? I think, and you both stated it clearly, and we have long known that there's a strong core of anti-Semitism to so-called anti-Zionism. A couple of people have asked in terms of what can be done, and one mechanism suggested was potentially even a legal recourse. quoting terrorist organizations that are prescribed terrorist organizations in this country. Is there some sort of a recourse? ABC is a great example of quoting as a reliable source, terrorist organization. Are you both aware of any recourse to try to address this, or any other examples of how we can turn this sort of false reporting around, just practical steps? I mean,
I think I've seen a few things, and then I'll show you, Liz. I think when it is raised in the media, that's helpful. Like we saw Tom Joyner was removed from the Middle East. I think when politicians like James Paterson and others raise it at Senate estimates, when they ask the ABC bosses who appear, do they condone this coverage? Why is that acceptable? Isn't that a breach of the ABC's charter, which requires independence and balance and accuracy? I think that's important. But I think people can also write complaints to the communications minister, Michelle Rowland, write complaints to the Prime Minister, write complaints to the ABC. There is an official complaints process at the ABC. So I think I think that needs to be done. ACMA, the Australian Communications Media Authority, has to address complaints, as we know at Sky when we get them.
Yes.
They have to address complaints. So a serious complaints to the Australian Communications Media Authority, when there is cause for that, is very important. Do you have anything to add to that?
Not really, except that, it's all about accountability, and it doesn't really exist without people bringing it to either the relevant body's attention or, ABC have Media Watch, where they literally pull usually us, try to pull us up on what they deem as being inaccurate. And this is how we keep each other accountable. We will dob on each other essentially and pull each other up on it. And as Sharri says, MPs also play a great part, because with a simple statement they can make something headline news. But don't underestimate the role that everyday watchers play. You can write into any channel that you see dispersing what you feel is anti-Semitic or otherwise, and let them know that you're watching and you've noticed and it's unacceptable.
I've just picked up on the comment you made earlier, particularly as Jewish people, and the way we're feeling at the moment in terms of the coverage. Anti-Semitism obviously shouldn't be a political issue. The barbarity that we witnessed on October 7 should cut across all politics. And fortunately, we see in the US that there's almost complete bipartisan support for Israel on this. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday that commented that a lot of the Jews in New York, for example, liberal democratic Jews, have been switching to Fox News because we just need it at the moment, regardless of your politics. There are a few sources of validation of this horror. It's not just conservative news media. MSNBC has been fantastic. Morning Joe. I often watch that at night because it just gives me an uplift in terms of, and it's not a conservative channel, but they've actually been very, very pro-Israel as well. Could you just comment, and there's been a few questions pointing in this direction, and you've commented on it a little bit as well, in terms of what motivates the media to provide that distorted reporting. To what extent is it the media are influencing events, and the hospital was a good example, and to what extent is it them just reflecting particular parts of our society? In other words, is the bias as much within society itself, and the journalists are just playing to that, or are they actually, drive? I mean, who's the chicken, who's the egg here in terms of what we're talking?
I think it's very strongly at the ABC. That's the bias that those journalists have.
Right.
100%. And you can see that by what they post on social media. People's personal views used to be very well hidden, and now they're not. You just have to look at a journalist's Twitter feed or Facebook or Instagram post, and you can see how they feel about an issue. So I do think it's the journalists driving that, and you know, the public just, I mean, the public, how would they know that Israel haven't bombed a hospital? They wouldn't know. And just before I move to Liz, I just want to say that what you said about Fox News, it's so interesting because, you know, when a major event happens, like the war, you know, when the terror attack happened on Israel, obviously on that Saturday evening, we turned on the television immediately. We were swapping CNN, BBC, Fox News, you know, you flick the channels to try, Sky News, to try and get the latest news. But then a few days in, when the coverage on CNN started to become anti-Israel, and it's so deeply personal and upsetting, I couldn't handle it anymore either. And I said to my husband, I can't watch CNN anymore. And I agree with you. I was watching, and I always love, you know, Fox and Friends. I love Fox News anyway, but I couldn't handle watching CNN anymore. I had to watch Fox News because you're feeling so devastated already. You're feeling so depressed and distressed already. You can't take, you know, further anger and irritation when you're already seeing it on social media the whole time, in the news the whole time. So I did exactly what you're talking about, Dan. Do you want to?
I'd say the bias is definitely coming from the journos, Dan, because what people need to understand when they see these lefty leaning and sometimes simply outrageously untrue or pro-Palestine, they like to call it, reports, is that this is designed to manipulate public sentiment, so that people who read it and people who watch it, again, from a source that they think is very trusted, like the ABC, accept it unquestioningly. And that's the power of the media, and they can use it for good and they can use it for bad. But when it is as inherently left-leaning as those employed by the ABC, sadly, I don't think a conservative could possibly get a job there nowadays.
Well, not just a conservative, a Jewish person. I mean, I have
completely.
one Jewish friend who works at the ABC, and it's a very hostile environment at the moment.
Incredibly, I can only imagine. So sadly, I think it is, very much, it's wartime propaganda. They're fighting for hearts and minds, and they believe they've got a just cause, and they're determined to get people on side through their work. So,
all right. We try to use every opportunity to highlight the issue of the hostages for obvious reasons. And so, and there've been a few questions that are pointing in that direction, so I'm deliberately pulling them out. The basic gist of the questions is, why isn't it recognized by the media that if the hostages were released, there'd be a much better chance of getting the much sought after pause, let alone some sort of well, I won't say ceasefire, but at least pause. There seems to be a feeling that there's been insufficient focus on that. We've got at least 239 hostages, children, babies, men, women, etc., older people. Why do you feel, just as human beings, that the journalists haven't focused more on that in general?
Do you want to start with this one?
Well, I think it puts the blame fairly and squarely on Hamas. Israel has repeatedly said till they're blue in the face, if you just give us back the hostages, we'll down tools. They have repeatedly said, Netanyahu had said point blank, quote, not a single civilian needs to die. We've created safe zones. We've told you just give our hostages back. We're doing everything we possibly can. And I think that's the reason why, again, the left-leaning media, those who would call themselves pro-Palestine narrative, don't focus on it, because it points fairly and squarely at the fact that the only reason why this is still going is because Hamas will not relent. And they've said so repeatedly. And if they were to recant and give the Israelis their hostages back, this would be, for now, over.
Well, I think Netanyahu has also said he's going to destroy Hamas. That is the goal. And I think that has to happen. And we also see this narrative pushed in the media of there should be a ceasefire. And I feel that at its very core, the demands for a ceasefire are anti-Semitic, because what they're saying is a ceasefire with Hamas, which won't stop, as you pointed out earlier, won't stop until all of Israel, their goal is the annihilation of Israel, the annihilation of the Jewish people. So how can you have a ceasefire with Hamas? It'll, as Hillary Clinton has said, it'd only, and even the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, I think his name is in the UK.
Yes.
A ceasefire with Hamas would only give them time to regroup, would only embolden them, and they'd come back and attack harder and stronger. And at this point, you can't have a ceasefire. They have to be wiped out. And I think that is a hardline position. But Israel has asked for civilians to evacuate, and it is Hamas that's stopping the evacuation. Egypt also that's stopping the evacuation, and we need to keep that in context. Their loss of lives, and no one wants to see anyone innocent lose lives. It's so tragic, especially as a mother. You think it's just, you want everyone's children and families to be safe, but Hamas has to be held responsible if it doesn't allow those civilians to leave, and we aren't seeing that sentiment reflected in the media or by our politicians.
And also, Dan, a lot of we see posters of the hostages being ripped down all around the world.
Yeah.
Most recently here in Bondi, right in our backyard, really. And I think, again, people accuse those of us who do recognize them as that being anti-Palestine propaganda, those ripping down these hostage posters. In all the videos I've seen of it happening, they're just saying this is propaganda, this isn't true, and they try this on time and time again, whether it's the beheaded babies, whether it's whatever atrocity that has been committed. Again and again, these people march and say, we're in solidarity with Palestine, and basically infer or outright say what you're saying isn't true. And therefore, again, for the lefty-leaning media to constantly be recognizing the hostages as they should, it's not reinforcing that pro-Palestinian narrative of, oh, this is just Israeli propaganda.
Yeah, and look, I should stress, as an organisation, JNF, we're not political, and it's important for our audience to have that acknowledged. However, this is an issue of humanity, and we would like to think that, regardless of your politics, that when we see that level of barbarity, anybody as a human being would just react regardless. And so it's important to acknowledge on all sides of politics that there have been some wonderful journalists, politicians, leaders, etc., who've called it out for what it is. I don't think any side of politics has an exclusive, exclusive connection with either the truth or falsity. Could you maybe leave us with a bipartisan message, dare I say, of hope, or some way that we can all sort of find our common humanity together, both in the reporting of what goes on in the world? Can we find a common truth? And before the horror of October 7th, we already saw the polarity in society through the pandemic. We saw it, and conspiracy theories come up, and we see it research again now when people are debating even basic facts, horrific facts. Do you see any way we can converge on a sort of a common humanity, and maybe give you guys sort of that to close out on?
Continue on or pick up on your bipartisan support. New South Wales Premier Chris Minns has been amazing. He's amazing. Couldn't be stronger. He's a Labor Premier, and I know the Jewish community in New South Wales is very grateful for that support. Like I said, Bill Shorten has come out very strongly. He's Labor. There have been other Labor figures as well. The problem is Albanese and Penny Wong. They are from the left, and they are in those crucial positions of Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. Look, a message of hope. I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic. I'm not a pessimistic person by nature, but it just feels like the anti-Semitism is so deep, is so strong at the moment, here and around the world, and you're just seeing worse cases every single day. I mean, the hope is that when the war ends, it'll go back to being beneath the surface, the anti-Semitism, but I think it's exposed a level of anti-Semitism that was, you know, that was latent, that it's the rebirth of anti-Semitism. It's a reawakening of it. I don't feel hopeful right now. I'm sorry. I feel devastated. I think there are a lot of people trying to do good things, trying to tackle this problem. I think, you know, I did a session about a week ago with Lord Mann, who's the anti-Semitism envoy for the UK government. He's a House of Lords.
Great. We had him on our virtual gala a couple of years ago. He's fantastic.
Yeah, so exactly. So I interviewed him about a week ago for a Maccabi session. And I think we need a position like that. And I you know, I've mentioned it to a few people, federally, politicians. I think we need an anti-Semitism envoy, an anti-Semitism advisor for the federal Labor government. And I think that's the only thing I can see that would be a practical, that would deliver practical solutions, because they could work with the universities on explaining to the tutors, the students' clubs, how what they're doing is unacceptable, is anti-Semitic. They could work with the university campuses, just like Lord Mann works with Cambridge and Oxford in the UK. They could work with, you know, our political parties. We saw the Greens storm out in protest this afternoon. They could work with any other institution where anti-Semitism is rife. And that's the only thing I can see at the moment, or a new body to give this sort of advice that would help, because otherwise I just despaired, Anne.
But on an up note, just know, everyone watching, that you aren't alone. I was having a conversation with a colleague just the other day, and we were talking about Keir Starmer coming out and saying, you know, launching Islamophobic month awareness, etc., and so on, and how unfeeling it is at such a time, and etc., and so on. And he said, well, he's done this because, you know, London only has 200,000 Jewish community, and he's shilling for votes, and he knows that there's more Muslims than there are Jews, and therefore, you know, that's who he's pandering to. And I want to finish on what I said in response to my colleague, and that is what these politicians, if and when that is what they're doing, trying to play to a different base and shilling for votes and playing with something as crucially as important as this, but simply trying to get re-elected and only thinking of the ballot box, they need to remember that there are millions of righteous Gentiles like myself who are on the side of Israel. And we'll fight for your cause, and are fighting for your cause just as hard. So just remember, you are not alone, and combined with us, you are not a small minority. And remember that always.
And just, sorry to add to that, some Sky News viewers who are not Jewish, one lady wrote to me to say she's added a Magen David next to the cross that she wears. Someone else says he's now wearing an Israel friendship pin on his suit. Someone else sent flowers. You know, we're seeing a lot of support from mainstream Australians who can clearly see what's going on and hate the anti-Semitism.
Well, and just to add to that list, there's a long list, but if anybody hasn't seen Senator Graham's speech when he was in Israel, that short thing, it really was uplifting as well, an example of that positive aspect that we have to cling to, because as you're right, Sharri, there's a lot to be pessimistic about. So we'll thank you both, and not just for tonight, but for everything you do every day and every night on your shows, in terms of presenting us with the facts of the situation and doing it in a fair way. And like to just finish by praying for the safe return of the hostages, and for the security and safety of all of Israel's citizens and soldiers. And thank you again on behalf of all of our audience.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Am Yisrael Chai.
Am Yisrael Chai. I would break out in song, but no one wants to hear me sing. Thank you.
Thanks.